But it seems none of the Levites' fellow Israelites are inclined to offer their hospitality. It's a little ironic, considering that the Levi got more hospitality than he wanted from his father-in-law, and now he can't get any hospitality from these Benjamites. And the old man who eventually takes them in, if you were a guest at my house, I couldn't promise that you wouldn't find a rubber rat in your room or toilet paper that doesn't tear in the guest bathroom. That's because even though I'm a grandmother, I am still a child in many ways, and it shows up in my hospitality. What can I say? On today's Scriptureology lesson, we are going to meet a man whose idea of hospitality is on a totally different planet than either yours or mine. Before we get into that, I think I'm just going to throw these down here, or you'll be looking at them the whole time. Last week, we noted that the ending chapters of Judges gave us a look into the state of the priesthood during the time of the Judges. We met a career ladder climbing apostate Levite priest named Jonathan. Turned out to be the grandson of Moses. But if you thought Jonathan was bad, the priest we're about to meet makes him look like a Boy Scout. Chapter 19 opens with the introduction of this sojourning Levite. Just like Jonathan in our last lesson, this Levite doesn't live in one of the cities designated for Levites, but he also lives in the hill country of Ephraim. And also like Jonathan, he has ties to Bethlehem. This Levite has a concubine who's from Bethlehem. Okay, a concubine was a second-class wife who had all the responsibilities of a wife and less of the legal rights. She was entitled to receive food and clothing and marital privileges, but any children that she bore wouldn't necessarily have the same inheritance rights as children born to a legal wife. Abraham and Jacob had concubines. So did one of the judges that we studied earlier. Do you remember who? Here's a hint. It was a man who refused to be made king when it was offered to him. That was Gideon. And his son by a concubine was that rascal Abimelech, whose name meant, "My father is king." Okay, so concubines don't have the full rights of a wife. And this Levite man, he has one. And apparently, he's had some trouble with her. Most Bible translations, including the ESV that I teach from, they say that his concubine was unfaithful to him. The Hebrew phrase that's used in verse 2 is translated as unfaithful, but it's not used anywhere else in the Bible, so it's really difficult to be precise about the meaning of that phrase. The oldest translation of the Hebrew text, the Greek Septuagint, it says that she was angry with him. And another ancient text says that she despised him. That she was angry with or despising of the Levite, it seems the most accurate rendering, not only because it's the oldest interpretation of the Hebrew, but also because of what happens next. The concubine runs to her father's house. Now, that's an unlikely action if she had been adulterous, because adultery would bring not only shame to the woman's husband, it would also shame her father. And on top of that, after a period of 4 months, we're told that the Levite goes after his concubine in order to speak kindly to her and win her back. That suggests an acknowledgement that she had been provoked to leave in the first place. If a man's been cheated on and he decides he wants to reconcile with a woman, especially in ancient days when a woman was absolutely dependent on a man for provision, then the man holds the cards, and he's more likely to have the attitude that he is allowing her a second chance, rather than humbling himself to speak kindly and try to win her back, as the text says. He'd humble himself if he was acknowledging that he did something in order to deserve her anger. In a little bit, we're going to see some of his character that doesn't make the possibility that he mistreated her in the past much of a stretch for our imaginations. Now, there's a tidbit tucked in verse 3 that says that when the Levite traveled back to Bethlehem to claim his concubine, he had his servant with him. The Hebrew noun indicates that this was a male servant. Okay, save that piece of information in your head for later. So the Levite arrives at his father-in-law's house. Even if she was a concubine, the relation was still considered an in-law. He travels to his house and he's reconciled with his concubine there. He spends 3 days eating and drinking with his father-in-law, and then he's ready to take his woman and go home. But his father-in-law prevails on him to spend another day. On the 4th day, he expects that he's going to depart, but his father-in-law again asks him to stay. On the 5th day, the Levites had enough hospitality, and he is hitting the road for home with his concubine, his servant, and his donkeys. Problem is, they leave too late in the day to make it all the way back home that day. They've traveled just 5.5 miles, and then they reach Jerusalem. And there the Levite's servant suggests that they spend the night there. Let's see what's decided about that suggestion as I read Judges chapter 19, verses 12 through 21. And his master said to him, "Will we not turn," as I turn the page, "aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel? But we will pass on to Gibeah." And he said to his young man, "Come and let us draw near to one of the places and spend a night at Gibeah or Ramah." So they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. And behold, an old man was coming in from his work in the field at evening. And the man was from the hill country of Ephraim and was sojourning in Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjamites. And he lifted up his eyes and he saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said to him, "Where are you going and where do you come from?" And he said to him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I am going to the house of the Lord, but no one has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys and bread and wine for me and your female servant and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything." And the old man said, "Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants, only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him into his house and gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. The Levites' reason for refusing to spend the night in Jerusalem is that it's inhabited by foreigners, and he'd rather spend the night in a city of his own people, the Israelites. Now, if you'll remember all the way back to the first chapter of Judges, we read there that Jerusalem was captured and burned by the men of Judah as they moved through Canaan on their way to possess their own territorial inheritance. So the Israelites captured Jerusalem, but apparently they didn't keep it. Jerusalem was in the tribe of Benjamin's territory. So it was the tribe of Benjamin who were responsible for letting the Jebusites reestablish their population in Jerusalem. We should also note that the city the Levite prefers to spend the night in, Gibeah, that's also in the territory of Benjamin. And that's where the traveling party has moved on to. It's north of Jerusalem, just another 3.5 miles. So the small Levite traveling party arrives in the city square of Gibeah, and they do what was the custom for travelers in that day. They waited for a stranger to invite them to spend the night at their house. Now, when I say stranger, I mean that it would be a person unknown to them. But this was also a city known to them to be inhabited by the people of the Israelite tribe of Benjamin, and that's the reason the Levite wanted to stay there in the first place. But it seems none of the Levites' fellow Israelites are inclined to offer their hospitality. It's a little ironic, considering that the Levi got more hospitality than he wanted from his father-in-law, and now he can't get any hospitality from these Benjamites. And the old man who eventually takes them in after working a long day in the field, he isn't a Benjamite himself. Verse 16 says that he was from the hill country of Ephraim. That's the same place where the Levite lived. So these two men are, to use the vernacular of the day, they're homeboys. It's like I automatically feel that I'm kin to anyone who's from upstate New York because that's where I was born and raised. I haven't lived there for 20 years, but every time I see a New York license plate on the highway, I put my hand over my heart and say, "Land of my birth," as my way of saluting another homie. I don't know why, but after all these years, my husband still rolls his eyes at me when I do it. You'd think maybe he'd get used to it or have been used to it by now. But perhaps he is just jealous that I think so highly of New York when he is apparently thinking so little of his birth state because he never salutes Texas license plates. Anyway, both of these men would have had Hill Country of Ephraim on their donkeys' license plates. So there's an instant affinity between them. And the old man, he's been in the Levite sandals. At some point, he'd been the new guy in town and likely had the same trouble getting a Benjamite to extend hospitality to him. So what do two people do when they've had trouble with the same group? They talk about him. The Levite just has to mention that it wouldn't be a hardship for any Benjamite to take his family in for the night because he had his own provisions, even for his donkeys. I can almost hear him adding a after he got that off his chest. Why do I think that? Honestly, because I'm probably projecting the way I would say it. When people don't give us what we need, we reserve the right to gripe about them. The funny thing is, when people do give us what we need, we reserve the right to gripe about that too. Usually our complaint is that what's provided isn't good enough. And it's not just those on the receiving end of hospitality who complain, or those who are unbelievers. If it weren't so, then Peter wouldn't have found it necessary, under the direction of the Holy Spirit, to write this admonishment to believers. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. Several years ago, my husband and I invited a visiting Chinese scholar and her 6-year-old daughter to stay in our home for several weeks. We had the room and we were happy to meet their need. At first, we found out very quickly that it was their custom to have a snack before bedtime. Okay, normally that's no big deal. My husband or my kids would do that too. But these Chinese folks' favorite snack was fried tofu. If you didn't immediately make a face when I said that, then you have no idea what a pungent reek fried tofu makes in your house. It was like a large dog had passed gas in every room of the house. You just didn't want to breathe and you couldn't get away from it. My family and I, we'd try falling asleep with the sheets pulled up over our nose. Now, we never said a word to our house guests about their tofu frying, but you know, we did not suffer in silence either. It was all we could talk about to each other and to any sympathetic ear we could find for the entire 6 weeks that they were with us. Now, I don't expect any eternal reward for that kind of grumbling hospitality. We all got our reward in the sympathy that others gave us when we complained to them. In hindsight, what I should have done, or maybe made my husband do, was to talk to them about our sensitivities to the tofu frying and see if another snack could be substituted during their time with us. That's what a mature person would do. And it's not unloving. Believers are commanded to extend hospitality. It's a requirement if you're going to be an elder in your church. But let's not follow my pitiful example and grumble away our reward for it, or even let a failure keep you from being hospitable again in the future. The Son of God came to this earth, and he was dependent on the hospitality of others during his itinerant ministry. Genuine, selfless hospitality, that's an important service to God. Well, the Levite and his concubine, they're safely tucked in for the night at the house of the old Ephraimite. So they think. There's a horror about to unfold that we'll read about right after this brief break. I'm excited to tell you about the new book study we'll be doing after the first of the year. It's the book of Romans. It was studying the book of Romans that persuaded an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther in the year 1515 that people are justified by faith alone in Jesus Christ. And the rediscovery and preaching of this revelation in God's Word lit the fires of Reformation in the church. Romans is arguably the most theologically rich book of the Bible. It highlights the righteousness of God, and it's my prayer our study of it will light Reformation fires in our hearts. I'd covet your prayers as I prepare our lessons and ask that you make plans to join me for a life-changing study of the book of Romans. Invite a friend to watch with you. There's no reason to keep you in suspense about what happens next. So listen as I read Judges chapter 19, verses 22 through 30. As they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Violate them and do what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. As the dawn began to break, they let her go. As morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. And her master rose up in the morning, and when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let us be going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, "Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak." It would have been kinder if the Benjamites had continued to ignore the traveler like they did when he was planted in their city square hoping for some hospitality. They wanted to know him. To be perfectly clear about what the men of Gibeah are asking for, they want to have sex with the new Levite in town. The Hebrew word translated know is the word yadah, which we've seen early in our study means to know by experience, as Adam knew his wife Eve and had a son. These were the fellow Israelites that the Levi thought he'd be safer with than the foreigners he rejected back in Jerusalem. They turned out to be as wicked as the Jebusites. Maybe that's why the Benjamites allowed Jebusites to repopulate Jerusalem. They were birds of a feather. Now, where the Benjamites seemed to have a perverted take on hospitality, it seemed that the old Ephraimite, he did too. How could he offer the mob his own virgin daughter to violate and do what seems good to you? Now, that's exactly the offer Lot made in a similar situation in Genesis 19. The willingness to sacrifice a virgin daughter demonstrates to us how seriously the ancients were committed to the protection of those who came under their roof, even if they were strangers. I know we can't wrap our minds around that concept. We'd be like, blood is thicker than water. Sorry, dude. Good luck out there. Now, I'd like to think that the first verse of the section that I just read had a significant bearing on the Levites' reaction to the lusty mob that surrounded the house. Verse 22 said that the old man and the Levite were making their hearts merry. The verse before that said they were drinking. So maybe the fact that he's at least a little intoxicated had something to do with his decision to push his concubine out the door to be violated and abused. But here's my question. Remember I asked you earlier before the break to tuck a piece of information away. That piece of information was that the Levite had a male servant with him. My question is then, why would the Levite push his female concubine, who he had traveled a distance to retrieve and humbled himself to reconcile with? Why push her out the door instead of the male servant that the homosexual mob probably would have been more placated with? I can't answer my own question. I have no idea. It just doesn't seem to make logical sense. And perhaps there's more about this ancient culture I just can't wrap my mind around. Or maybe this guy always treated his concubine with illogical callousness, and that explains why she ran away from him and back to her daddy in the first place. Well, the illogical, callous behavior, it didn't stop when he pushed her out the door. What did he do next? He went to sleep. Again, maybe this had something to do with the effects of the alcohol in his system. Hey, we are cutting him some speculative grace on that. But there is no explanation and no excuse to be made about why he mutilated and desecrated her body in such a horrific manner. And then he put the pieces in the local Pony Express mail to be delivered to the other 11 tribes of Israel. And as wicked and as lawless as the people of Israel had become, even during this time, even they were shocked. They said they hadn't seen or heard anything this ghastly that they could remember since the time of the Exodus. And you know what? That is exactly the reaction that the Levite was going for. By sending body parts to the other 11 tribes, he is inciting them to act on his behalf and to seek vengeance against the men of Gibeah and the tribe of Benjamin. We'll see how that develops in our lesson next week. But in the time that we have remaining today, I want to talk about what these stories of the apostate Levite from last week and the heartless Levite from this week, what do those stories mean for us? They're a window into the condition of the priesthood at this time. And granted, it's a pretty bad view. But so what? You know, we could say, that was then, this is now. What these stories confirm for us is that the Levite priesthood of the Old Covenant was insufficient. They point us to a man's need, all of our need, for a better covenant. Stay with me, because this is very important. Back in Exodus, God gave Moses instructions for building the tabernacle and instituting the priesthood. Then Leviticus chapter 21 gives more and specific instruction for the priests. And there's a whole nother tier of restrictions for the man who was the high priest. He couldn't touch any dead body, couldn't marry a widow, he had to marry a virgin, and he couldn't have any kind of physical defect. Why? Kind of sounds discriminating to our ears, but it was all to highlight the holiness of God and the holiness demanded of those who come into his presence. In verse 8 of Leviticus chapter 21, the concept is introduced that priests must be holy because God is holy. So here's a question. Why aren't modern priests or pastors held to the same standard? Why aren't we handing pink slips to every pastor who has poor vision, like I do, or a limp, or psoriasis? Is God any less holy? Of course he's not. Here's the bad news. Those requirements, they have never been negated. But here's the good news. Those requirements have been fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ, who is the high priest of the new covenant of grace. See, we never have to worry that the priest who intercedes on behalf of those who place their faith in the Son of God We never have to worry that that priest will fall into an unholy state, like the kind that we see the priests and judges falling into. We are never going to be at a loss for a mediator to restore our broken fellowship with the Father that our sin results in, because our mediator is doing something like cutting up his concubine or holding a worship service before a carved image covered with silver. Now, granted, these Levites and judges were probably the worst examples of their tribes. Okay, let's hope that they were the worst examples of their tribe. But you know what? Even on his best day, the best priest still had to make a sacrifice for his own sin. But Jesus never did, and Jesus never will. The book of Hebrews has a lot to say about how superior Jesus is as a priest compared to the former Levitical priests. Take a look at these 3 verses. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he, speaking of Jesus, he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. How thankful we should be that Jesus is our perfect high priest. Unlike the Levite that we met today, he is not cold, he is not callous toward his bride. Instead of pushing her out the door to helplessly fend for herself, Jesus sacrificed his own life so that his bride might live. Next week, we are going to be wrapping up our study of the book of Judges, and we'll be looking at chapters 20 and 21. So I hope that you'll prepare and read those chapters, again, 20 and 21 in advance. After that, we're going to be doing a short study of the book of Ruth. You know, that choice makes sense because the events of Ruth take place during the period of the Judges. We'll be encouraged to see that even during such a faithless time as this period, God was working to orchestrate the arrival of the perfect high priest that his people needed so much. So join us then for our study of Ruth, and next week for our last lesson on the book of Judges.
This program is viewer-supported. If you appreciate in-depth Bible study on television, please consider supporting our ministry with a gift. You can contribute online at Scriptureology.com or at the address on your screen.